The letters Evelyn never opened. The rain had been falling over Bar Harbour since early afternoon, not the violent kind of rain that arrived with thunder and drama, but the slow New England rain that seemed to seep into the bones of old houses and lonely people. By 6 o'clock, the streets were nearly empty. Storefront lights glowed softly against the wet pavement, and the ocean beyond the harbour disappeared into a grey curtain of mist. Inside her small Boston apartment, Claire Bennet sat curled beneath a blanket on the couch, half listening to the evening news while sorting through photographs from a recent assignment. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and old books. A single lamp glowed beside her, casting soft amber light across scattered black and white prints. Most of the photographs were of strangers: a retired fisherman in Gloucester, an elderly widow standing outside a bakery in Vermont, a grandfather teaching his grandson how to repair a watch. Claire had spent years telling other people's stories. Sometimes she wondered if it was easier than facing her own. The phone rang just after 6:17 p.m. She glanced at the screen and froze for a moment. Grandma Evelyn. Claire immediately sat upright. Her grandmother almost never called unexpectedly, especially at night. Claire answered quickly, "Grandma." For a second there was only silence. Then came the soft crackle of the line and the distant sound of wind. "Claire, sweetheart." Evelyn's voice sounded weaker than usual, older somehow. Claire frowned. "Are you all right?" Another pause. "Yes," Evelyn said softly. "I think so." "Think so." Those two words tightened something inside Claire's chest. Outside the apartment window, rain slid slowly down the glass. Claire stood and walked toward the kitchen unconsciously, listening carefully. "I wanted to ask you something," Evelyn continued. Her voice trembled slightly. "I'd like you to come home for Thanksgiving this year." Claire leaned against the counter. "Of course I will. And stay a little longer this time." Something about the request felt different, too careful, too deliberate. Claire opened the refrigerator absent-mindedly, staring inside without seeing anything. "Grandma, are you sick?" The silence that followed felt endless. Finally, Evelyn let out a small, tired laugh. "No worse than 78 usually feels." Claire smiled faintly, though unease lingered beneath it. In the background, she could hear the grandfather clock from Evelyn's hallway ticking steadily. Tick, tick, tick. A sound Claire remembered from childhood. A sound tied to cinnamon tea, wool blankets, ocean storms, and sleepless nights in the old house by the sea. Evelyn hesitated. "There are things I should have said a long time ago." Claire's expression hardened slightly. "What kind of things?" But Evelyn didn't answer directly. "Daniel's already here helping me with the garden before winter comes." Claire nodded to herself. That sounded like Daniel. Her younger cousin had always adored Evelyn more than anyone else in the family. "You should come tomorrow if you can," Evelyn whispered, "before the storm gets worse." "Storm?" Claire walked toward the living room window. The weather report earlier had mentioned a coastal storm moving through Maine by morning. "I'll leave early," Claire said. Another long silence. Then Evelyn spoke again, quieter this time. "Claire?" Yes, if something happened to me, there are letters in the house that need to be understood. Claire's stomach tightened. What letters? But the line crackled. Then Evelyn simply said, "Drive safely tomorrow," and hung up. For several seconds, Claire stood motionless in the middle of her apartment. The rain tapped softly against the windows. Something felt wrong, not dramatic, not urgent, but heavy, like a door slowly opening somewhere far away. 300 miles north, the Harper house sat alone near the rocky coastline of Bar Harbor. The old cedar-shingled home had weathered decades of storms. Salt air had faded the paint long ago, and the porch groaned whenever the wind rose from the ocean. Inside, warm yellow light spilled from the kitchen windows. Daniel Harper stood at the sink, washing pie dishes while jazz music played softly from an old radio. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon, baked apples, and black tea. Evelyn sat quietly at the table wearing a cream-coloured cardigan, her silver hair glowing softly beneath the overhead light. In front of her sat 3 small wooden boxes. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. "You've been staring at those things all night." Evelyn looked down at the boxes immediately, almost guilty. "Oh," she murmured, "just old papers." Daniel dried his hands. "You sure you're okay?" She smiled gently, the kind of smile older people used when they wanted to protect younger people from worry. "I'm fine," but Daniel noticed the untouched tea beside her, the trembling in her fingers, the exhaustion beneath her eyes. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Evelyn slowly opened one of the wooden boxes. Inside were dozens of letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. Daniel couldn't help noticing that every envelope looked worn from being handled many times. Almost loved. Evelyn carefully touched one envelope with the tips of her fingers, as if touching the past itself. "Grandma?" She looked up suddenly. "Yes? Who are those from?" For a brief second something flickered across her face. Fear, real fear. Then it vanished. Nobody important anymore. Daniel sensed she was lying, but before he could ask another question, Evelyn suddenly stood from the table, slowly, carefully, as though the weight of memory itself rested on her shoulders. "I think I'll go to bed early tonight." Daniel watched her leave the kitchen, carrying one single envelope in her hand. The old staircase creaked beneath her steps. A moment later, the house fell silent except for rain and distant ocean waves. Daniel looked toward the wooden boxes still sitting on the table. One envelope remained partially visible beneath the ribbon. The handwriting was elegant, masculine, and signed with a name Daniel had never heard before. Thomas. Late that night, Claire arrived at a small roadside motel, halfway to Maine. She couldn't sleep. Around midnight, she opened her laptop and searched through old family photos stored in cloud folders. Something about Evelyn's voice haunted her. Eventually, she found a scanned Thanksgiving photo from 1989. Evelyn stood smiling beside the kitchen table. Young Daniel sat on the floor colouring. Claire herself was missing 2 front teeth. Everyone looked happy, normal. But in the background, partially hidden near the staircase, stood a framed black and white photograph Claire had never noticed before. A man wearing a navy wool coat, tall, dark-haired, handsome in an old-fashioned way, and on the bottom corner of the frame, barely visible beneath the blur of age, were handwritten initials TR. Claire stared at the photograph as thunder rolled somewhere beyond the dark highway outside. Then she whispered softly to herself, "Who are you?" And far away in Bar Harbour, Evelyn Harper sat awake beside her bedroom window, holding an unopened letter in trembling hands while the ocean storm slowly rolled toward shore. The storm arrived before dawn. Heavy coastal winds slammed against the old Harper house hard enough to shake the windows in their frames. Rainwater streamed down the glass while ocean waves crashed violently against the cliffs below the property. By morning, the entire coastline of Bar Harbour seemed swallowed by grey fog. Claire arrived just after 9. Her tyres crunched across the wet gravel driveway as Daniel hurried outside holding an umbrella against the wind. "You made it!" he shouted over the storm. Claire stepped from the car, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The ocean air smelled cold and sharp, like salt and rain and old memories. Daniel hugged her quickly. "You look exhausted." "So do you." He laughed softly. "Grandma barely slept." Claire looked toward the house immediately. Warm golden light glowed behind the rain-covered windows. For a moment, the old home looked exactly as it had during childhood holidays, safe, unchanged, but the feeling disappeared almost instantly. Something in the air felt different now, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Inside, warmth wrapped around Claire immediately. The smell hit her first: cinnamon, tea, old wood, apple pie cooling somewhere nearby. The familiar scent nearly broke her heart. Evelyn stood near the stove wearing a pale blue cardigan, stirring soup slowly. When she turned and saw Claire, her tired face softened. "Oh, sweetheart." Claire crossed the kitchen quickly and hugged her tightly. Evelyn felt smaller than she remembered, fragile, like something slowly fading. "You shouldn't have driven in this weather," Evelyn whispered. "You sounded like you needed me here." Evelyn pulled away gently. For a second her eyes glistened with something unreadable. "I do." The day passed quietly. Rain battered the coastline endlessly while the three of them remained inside the old house. Daniel repaired a loose cabinet door. Claire helped prepare dinner. Evelyn drifted silently from room to room as though distracted by invisible thoughts. Several times Claire noticed her staring toward the hallway staircase, toward the second floor, toward the attic above it, and every time she did, her expression changed. Not fear exactly, something sadder, regret. That evening, while Daniel chopped vegetables in the kitchen, Claire wandered through the house alone. The old floors creaked beneath her socks. Family photographs lined the hallway walls. Birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings. Entire decades preserved in wooden frames. Yet now Claire studied each photo differently, searching, questioning, looking for signs she had somehow missed her entire life. At the end of the hallway stood the narrow staircase leading upward. The attic. Claire remembered it from childhood. Dusty, cold, full of forgotten things. She climbed slowly, each wooden step groaned softly beneath her weight. At the top, she pulled the hanging cord beside the door. A weak yellow bulb flickered overhead. The attic smelled exactly like memory itself. Dust, old paper, wood, time. Rain hammered the roof above her. Large sheets covered antique furniture in pale white cloth. Boxes filled every corner. Old Christmas decorations sat beside trunks that probably hadn't been opened in decades. Claire moved carefully through the shadows. Then she saw them. 3 wooden boxes stacked near the far wall. The same boxes Daniel had described the night before. Something tightened in her chest. She knelt beside them slowly. The wood looked worn smooth with age, almost polished by years of handling. For a moment Claire hesitated. Then she lifted the lid. Inside were bundles of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Her pulse quickened. She carefully untied one bundle. The envelopes were yellowed with age, some fragile enough to tear. Every single one was addressed in elegant cursive handwriting. Evelyn Harper. Claire turned one over slowly. Her breath caught. Forever yours, Thomas. Thunder rumbled overhead. Claire stared at the signature. Thomas. Again. She opened another and another. Same name, same handwriting, same quiet intimacy. Some envelopes had been opened carefully. Others remained sealed, untouched, as if Evelyn had never found the courage. Claire pulled one envelope free at random. October 14th, 1983. Her stomach dropped. 1983. That made no sense. Family stories claimed Thomas had died decades earlier. Claire sat frozen beneath the dim attic light while rain pounded above her. The house groaned softly around her, and suddenly she no longer felt alone, not physically, emotionally, as though the attic itself were crowded with ghosts. A floorboard creaked behind her. Claire spun around sharply. Evelyn stood near the doorway, silent, pale. For a moment neither woman spoke. The only sound was rain and the distant crashing ocean. Claire slowly held up one of the letters. Who was Thomas? Evelyn's face changed instantly. The colour drained from it. Her hands trembled faintly at her sides. Claire had never seen her grandmother look afraid before. Not truly afraid. Evelyn stared at the letter for a very long time. Then she whispered, "I prayed you'd never find those." Claire stood slowly. "You told me there were letters that needed to be understood." "I know." "Then tell me the truth." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, as though gathering strength. When she opened them again, they looked full of 60 years of exhaustion. "I loved him," she whispered. The attic suddenly felt colder. Claire's heartbeat echoed in her ears. "What do you mean you loved him?" Evelyn looked toward the rain-covered attic window. Far beyond it, the ocean disappeared into storm fog. "He was supposed to be forgotten." Claire stared at her grandmother in disbelief. "But Grandpa—" "I know." The words came sharply, painfully. Evelyn pressed one trembling hand against the wooden table beside her. Then, almost inaudibly, she said, "Your grandfather was never the great love story of my life." Thunder shook the house, and somewhere downstairs Daniel called their names, completely unaware that the entire history of their family had just begun to unravel. Long before the storms, before the silence, before guilt settled permanently into the corners of Evelyn Harper's life, Like dust inside an old house, there had been a summer so warm and golden that even 67 years later she could still remember exactly how the air smelled the first time she saw Thomas Reed standing at the harbour. It was July of 1958, and Bar Harbour was alive in those days in a way that no longer seemed possible in modern America, because the streets had still belonged to people instead of tourists, because neighbours still left their doors unlocked at night, because radios drifted openly through kitchen windows on humid evenings, while children chased each other beneath glowing street lamps until their mothers called them home. Evelyn was 20 years old that summer, young enough to still believe life would eventually become exactly what everyone promised it would be: simple, predictable, safe. Every morning she walked 3 blocks from her parents' narrow white house on Maple Street to Whitmore's bookshop, where she worked 6 days a week organizing shelves and wrapping novels in brown paper for wealthy summer visitors from Boston and New York who arrived along the coast wearing pressed linen and expensive perfume. The bookstore sat near the harbour, squeezed between a bakery and a hardware store whose front bell rang every time fishermen wandered inside for rope or nails or cigarettes, and by noon the entire street usually smelled of salt water, coffee, engine oil, and fresh bread drifting from the ovens next door. Evelyn loved the quiet rhythm of the shop, the soft turning of pages, the dust floating through sunlight, the peaceful predictability of stories. At least stories always made sense in the end. Real life rarely did. That afternoon, the heat hung low over the harbour while old jazz records played softly through the bookstore radio, and Evelyn stood behind the counter, carefully arranging a stack of new arrivals, when the front bell above the door suddenly rang. She looked up absently at first, and then the entire world seemed to stop moving. Thomas Reed stepped inside carrying the sunlight with him. Even years later, Evelyn would never fully understand why that first moment felt so different from every other ordinary moment that had come before it, because there was nothing dramatic about his entrance, nothing theatrical or cinematic, only a tall young man in a navy work shirt with tired eyes and wind-blown dark hair, standing quietly near the doorway, as if he wasn't entirely sure he belonged there any more. But something inside her shifted immediately. Thomas glanced around the bookstore slowly before his eyes settled on Evelyn, and then he smiled. Not arrogantly, not charmingly, just honestly, like someone genuinely relieved to see another human being. "You still sell Hemingway here?" he asked. His voice carried the rough warmth of cigarette smoke and ocean wind. Evelyn suddenly realized she had been staring. "Oh," she said softly, fumbling with the stack of books in her hands. "Yes, we do." Thomas walked toward the counter slowly, and as he approached, Evelyn noticed details she would remember for the rest of her life without ever intending to. The faint scar near his jaw, the smell of tobacco and seawater clinging to his clothes, the way exhaustion lingered behind his eyes despite the smile. He looked older than 28, not physically, emotionally, as if he had already seen too much of the world. "I just got back into town," he said, while glancing toward the shelves. feels strange seeing this place exactly the same. You grew up here. Unfortunately, Evelyn laughed before she could stop herself. Thomas smiled again, softer this time, and something dangerous began quietly unfolding between them in that tiny bookstore beside the harbour, while jazz music drifted lazily through the summer air. Over the following weeks, Thomas became part of Evelyn's daily life so naturally that later she would struggle to remember when exactly the friendship stopped feeling innocent. Sometimes he came into the bookstore pretending to browse while secretly waiting for her lunch break. Sometimes they walked along the harbour together, eating lobster rolls wrapped in paper, while fishing boats rocked gently beside the docks beneath screaming gulls. Sometimes they said almost nothing at all, and somehow those moments became the most important. Thomas spoke little about the war, though everyone in town knew he had served in Korea, and on certain evenings, when the light faded and silence stretched too long between them, Evelyn would notice a distant sadness pass across his face before disappearing just as quickly. One evening in late August, they sat together on the old pier, watching sunlight melt across the ocean, while a saxophone drifted faintly from a nearby restaurant patio, and Thomas suddenly asked, "Do you ever feel like everyone around here already decided who you're supposed to become?" Evelyn looked at him carefully. "All the time." Thomas leaned back against the wooden railing and lit a cigarette slowly, while the ocean wind tangled his dark hair. "That's why I left," he murmured. "Thought if I went far enough away, maybe I'd become somebody else. Did it work?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Evelyn felt her heartbeat stumble unexpectedly. "No," he said quietly. "Turns out you carry yourself everywhere." The air between them shifted after that, not suddenly, not obviously, but undeniably. By September, the entire town had started noticing how often Thomas Reed appeared beside Evelyn Harper. And, unfortunately, somebody else noticed too. His name was Richard Harper, and according to Evelyn's mother, he was exactly the kind of man a young woman should marry. If Thomas Reed felt like summer storms and jazz music and dangerous possibilities waiting beyond the horizon, then Richard Harper felt like winter fireplaces, pressed shirts, and a future already carefully arranged by other people long before Evelyn had ever been asked what she actually wanted. Richard came from one of the oldest families in Bar Harbor, a family whose money had quietly shaped half the town for generations through banks, shipping businesses, and real estate along the coast, and from the outside he appeared to be everything a respectable young woman in 1958 was expected to desire in a husband. He was handsome in the polished, traditional way that made older women smile approvingly at church socials, because his dark suits were always perfectly tailored, because his shoes never carried dust, because he spoke calmly and confidently about stability and responsibility and long-term plans, while men twice his age nodded in approval beside him. Evelyn's mother adored him immediately. Her father trusted him instantly, and the entire town behaved as though the engagement itself had already been decided before Evelyn had fully understood she was expected to agree. Richard Harper could give you a beautiful life, her mother often reminded her while folding laundry or preparing supper, speaking with the practical certainty common among women who had survived the Great Depression and no longer believed love alone was enough to sustain a marriage. A stable man matters more than exciting feelings. Evelyn usually remained quiet during those conversations because somewhere deep inside herself she already sensed the terrifying truth she was too young to fully articulate. Richard was the kind of man she could survive beside. Thomas was the kind of man she could destroy herself for. And there was a frightening difference between those two things. By October, autumn settled heavily across coastal Maine, painting the trees in deep shades of amber and rust, while cold winds swept through town, carrying the smell of rain and dying leaves. And during that same season, Evelyn's life slowly divided itself into two completely separate worlds. In one world, she attended formal dinners beside Richard Harper, while their parents discussed wedding dates, future investments, and possible homes near the harbour, as though Evelyn herself was simply another object being carefully moved into place within a respectable American life. And in the other world, she met Thomas Reed beside the lighthouse after dark, while ocean waves crashed violently below the cliffs, and the beam of white light swept endlessly across the black Atlantic, like a warning neither of them wanted to hear. Those nights near the lighthouse became dangerous in ways Evelyn didn't fully understand at first, because Thomas made her feel visible in a manner no one else ever had, as though every hidden fear and buried dream inside her became impossible to ignore whenever he looked at her. One cold evening, while they sat inside Thomas's old Chevrolet, overlooking the harbour with jazz music playing softly through the radio and rain tapping against the windshield, Thomas finally asked the question both of them had been avoiding for weeks. "Why are you really marrying him?" Evelyn stared through the fog glass toward the ocean. "I don't know. That's not true." She closed her eyes briefly. In the distance, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the coastline. "My family loves him," she whispered. "Everyone expects it." Thomas let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "Everyone except you." Silence filled the car, heavy, intimate, painfully honest. Evelyn looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, while her engagement ring caught faint light from the dashboard. "I'm trying to do the right thing." Thomas turned toward her slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice sounded softer than she had ever heard it before. "What if the right thing isn't the thing that's killing you inside?" The words settled into her chest so deeply that decades later she would still remember the exact way her heartbeat reacted when he said them. Outside, rain intensified against the windshield, while the lighthouse beam swept repeatedly across the dark ocean behind them, illuminating the inside of the car in brief flashes of pale silver light. Then Thomas reached carefully into the pocket of his jacket and removed a folded envelope. "I wrote this last night," he said quietly. Evelyn looked at the envelope but didn't take it immediately. "What is it?" "My attempt at honesty." Finally, she accepted it with trembling fingers. The paper felt warm from his hands. "Don't open it until you're alone," he whispered, And for one terrible, beautiful moment, neither of them moved, because both understood something irreversible had already begun unfolding between them, something larger than logic or reputation or common sense, something capable of ruining entire lives. Then suddenly headlights appeared behind them near the road leading toward town. Thomas immediately stiffened. Evelyn turned sharply. A black Ford sedan slowed briefly near the overlook before continuing past. But Evelyn's stomach dropped instantly. She recognized the car, Richard Harper, and as the taillights disappeared into the rain, Evelyn realized with growing horror that her carefully separated worlds had just begun colliding. By the time November arrived along the coast of Maine, the world around Evelyn Harper had become divided into hours that belonged to other people and hours that belonged only to Thomas Reed, and the difference between those two lives had started exhausting her in ways she could neither explain nor escape. During the daytime she performed the role everyone expected of her with growing precision, smiling politely beside Richard Harper during church gatherings, discussing wedding invitations with her mother over tea, pretending interest when older women spoke admiringly about linens and china patterns and the respectable future waiting ahead of her, while deep inside she felt herself drifting further and further away from the person everyone believed her to be. But at night everything changed, because night belonged to secrets. Night belonged to oceans and silence and headlights cutting through fog-covered roads, while the rest of the town slept safely inside warm houses, unaware that Evelyn Harper, the polite bookstore girl everyone considered proper and predictable, had begun slipping out her bedroom window after midnight to meet another man beside the lighthouse cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. The lighthouse stood nearly 2 miles beyond town, where the coastline became rough and uneven, where jagged rocks disappeared beneath violent black waves, and cold winds screamed endlessly through tall grass bent toward the sea. And for reasons neither of them ever fully discussed, Thomas always parked his old Chevrolet there whenever they needed somewhere the world could not reach them. On those nights, the car became its own fragile universe, a place outside consequence, a place where Evelyn could finally breathe honestly. One evening, while freezing rain drifted softly across the windshield and jazz music played low through the radio, Thomas sat with one arm resting along the steering wheel, while Evelyn leaned back against the passenger seat, wrapped inside his wool coat, which still smelled faintly of tobacco, cedarwood, and ocean air. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The lighthouse beam swept rhythmically across the ocean outside, illuminating the car interior every few seconds in pale silver flashes before darkness swallowed them again. Finally Thomas broke the silence. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Evelyn turned toward him slowly. "Leaving where?" "Here." His voice carried exhaustion beneath it tonight, not frustration, not anger, something sadder. "I mean really leaving," he continued quietly while staring through the windshield toward the crashing waves below the cliffs. "California, Chicago, anywhere people don't already know your entire life before you even introduce yourself." Evelyn smiled faintly. "You make it sound easy." Thomas laughed softly under his breath. "It isn't easy. That's the whole point. Outside, ocean wind rattled the car slightly. Evelyn watched him carefully in the dim dashboard light, noticing the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the loneliness he tried so hard to hide beneath humor and cigarettes and impossible dreams. "Would you really go?" she asked. Thomas looked at her immediately. "With you?" The question settled between them with terrifying weight. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened. Thomas leaned back slowly against the seat. "There's this little jazz club in San Francisco I read about while I was overseas," he said softly. "Tiny place near the water. Piano all night long. Nobody there would care who your father is, or what church you attend, or whether your dress is respectable enough for Sunday dinner." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly while listening to the rain. For one dangerous moment she allowed herself to imagine it. Another city, another life, no expectations, no family pressure, no carefully rehearsed future, waiting like a prison cell disguised as safety. Just freedom. And Thomas, "You really think people like us get endings like that?" she whispered. Thomas stared at her for a long moment before answering. "No," he admitted quietly, "but I think we deserve the chance to try." The honesty in his voice nearly broke her heart, because deep down, Evelyn already knew she loved him. Not with the soft, practical affection people described at engagement parties while discussing compatibility and stability. Not with the safe, dependable love her mother believed built respectable marriages. This was something far more frightening, the kind of love that rearranged a person from the inside, the kind capable of destroying entire futures. And worst of all, she no longer wanted to stop it. Their secret meetings became more reckless after that night. Longer drives, longer conversations, longer silences where neither of them pretended any more. Sometimes they walked beside the cliffs, wrapped in heavy coats, while winter winds whipped violently around them, and Thomas spoke about places he wanted to show her someday, describing California sunsets and crowded jazz clubs and highways stretching endlessly toward freedom, while Evelyn listened as though he were describing another universe entirely. Sometimes they danced slowly beside the lighthouse with only the old Chevrolet radio playing softly in the background, while ocean waves exploded against the rocks below them beneath a sky full of cold white stars. And sometimes they simply sat together in silence because being near each other already felt dangerously close to happiness. One night, shortly before Christmas, snow began falling heavily while they sat parked near the harbour, watching fishing boats sway gently beneath glowing dock lights, and Thomas suddenly reached across the seat and took Evelyn's hand so carefully it almost felt like a question instead of a touch. "Come with me," he whispered. Evelyn looked at him, unable to breathe for a moment. "I'm serious." Snow drifted softly across the windshield, while jazz crackled quietly through the radio speakers. "We could leave after New Year's," Thomas continued, his voice low and steady now, as though he had rehearsed these words 1,000 times alone before finally saying them aloud. "I've got enough money saved for California if we're careful at first." Evelyn's eyes filled unexpectedly with tears. "Thomas, I know it's insane," he said quickly. I know your family would hate me forever, and this whole town would probably pretend you never existed, but Evelyn, his voice faltered slightly, I can't spend the rest of my life pretending I don't love you. The world outside the car seemed to disappear completely. There was only his face, his voice, the terrifying honesty in his eyes, and suddenly Evelyn realized something irreversible. If she stayed, she would lose herself. If she left, she would lose everyone else. Thomas gently brushed snowflakes from her coat sleeve. Say something. Evelyn opened her mouth carefully, but before words could come, a sharp wave of dizziness suddenly hit her. She pressed one hand against the dashboard. Thomas immediately turned toward her. What's wrong? I'm fine, she whispered, though her voice sounded distant even to herself. But she wasn't fine, because for several weeks now she had already suspected the truth quietly growing inside her. And later that night, standing alone in her tiny bathroom, while snow fell silently outside her bedroom window, Evelyn Harper stared at her trembling reflection and finally understood with absolute certainty that her entire life had just changed forever. She was pregnant. Fear arrived slowly at first, not as panic, not as hysteria, but as the crushing realization that every possible future ahead of Evelyn Harper now ended with somebody getting hurt. For several days after discovering the pregnancy, she moved through life in a strange fog of disbelief, continuing ordinary routines while internally feeling as though the entire world had tilted beneath her feet without warning. She still worked at the bookstore, still smiled politely at customers, still attended Sunday dinners with Richard Harper, and both families seated around the dining table discussing wedding plans beneath soft yellow lights, while roast chicken and polite conversation filled the room. But now every sound felt distant, muted. Every laugh seemed artificial. Every future everyone described for her suddenly felt impossible to survive. At night, she barely slept. Instead, she lay awake listening to winter wind scrape against tree branches outside her bedroom, while one terrifying question repeated endlessly inside her mind. What am I going to do? By January, the strain had started showing physically. Her mother noticed first. You look pale lately, she commented one snowy afternoon while folding laundry near the kitchen stove. Are you eating enough? Evelyn forced a smile without looking up from her tea. I'm just tired. But mothers who survive difficult lives learn to recognize fear in silence, and unfortunately, Evelyn's mother had begun suspecting far more than exhaustion. 3 nights later, everything finally collapsed. A blizzard had rolled across coastal Maine, burying Bar Harbor beneath heavy snow while violent winds rattled windows throughout town, and Evelyn sat downstairs alone beside the fireplace, waiting for Thomas to arrive at their usual meeting place near the lighthouse. He never came. At first she told herself the roads were too dangerous. Then she told herself his car probably wouldn't start in the cold. Then midnight arrived, and 1 o'clock, and 2. Still nothing. By dawn, panic had completely consumed her. The next day she searched everywhere she could without drawing attention to herself. The harbour, the bookstore, the mechanic shop near Main Street. but nobody had seen Thomas Reed in almost 3 days. And with every passing hour, Evelyn's fear slowly transformed into something even worse, abandonment. By the 4th day, her mother finally cornered her in the kitchen while snow fell heavily outside the windows. "What's happened to you?" Evelyn froze beside the sink. Her mother's expression hardened slowly as realization settled across her face with terrifying precision. "Oh my God," she whispered. The room suddenly felt too small to breathe inside. Evelyn turned away immediately, tears already burning behind her eyes. Her mother grabbed her arm sharply. "Is it Richard's?" The silence answered everything. For several seconds neither woman moved. Then her mother released her slowly, as though physically recoiling from the truth. "You foolish girl." Evelyn began crying instantly, not dramatic sobbing, just quiet, broken tears slipping uncontrollably down her face, while years of obedience and fear and loneliness finally cracked open all at once. "I love him," she whispered. Her mother stared at her in horror. "Love," she repeated sharply. "You think love matters here any more?" Outside, wind screamed against the house, while the kitchen clock ticked loudly through the silence. "He's gone," her mother continued, her voice colder now, more practical, more afraid. "Do you understand what happens if people find out?" Evelyn wrapped trembling arms around herself. Her mother stepped closer. "You will marry Richard immediately." The words landed like a prison sentence. "No, you don't have a choice." Tears streamed down Evelyn's face. "I can't lie to him." "You absolutely can," her mother snapped, "because if you don't, this family will become the town scandal for the next 20 years. The cruelty of the truth settled heavily between them. This was 1960. Women did not survive scandals like this gracefully, not in towns like Bar Harbor, not in families like theirs. A child born outside marriage would stain everyone connected to them. And somewhere beneath all her anger, Evelyn's mother was terrified too, terrified for her daughter, terrified of society, terrified of shame. That same evening, Richard Harper arrived unexpectedly, carrying groceries and firewood, after hearing the storm might continue through the weekend, and watching him move calmly through the kitchen while speaking kindly to her parents nearly shattered Evelyn completely, because Richard was not a cruel man. That made everything worse. He deserved honesty. Instead, she sat silently beside the fire while guilt slowly consumed her from the inside. Several times she almost told him everything. Several times she opened her mouth only to lose courage at the last second. And then, just after 9 o'clock, somebody knocked violently at the front door. Her father opened it. A postal worker stood outside, half covered in snow, holding a yellow telegram envelope. "Message for Miss Evelyn Harper." The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Evelyn accepted the envelope with trembling fingers. Even before opening it, some terrible instinct inside her already knew. The paper shook violently in her hands as she unfolded it beside the fireplace. Then the words blurred instantly through tears. "Regret to inform you, Thomas Reed was killed during travel incident outside Bangor. Stop details to follow. Stop." For a long moment, Evelyn heard absolutely nothing. Not the storm, not the fire, not her mother gasping softly behind her, only silence, a terrible endless silence swallowing the entire world whole. Then suddenly her knees gave out beneath her. Richard caught her before she hit the floor, and while snow buried the town outside beneath cold white darkness, Evelyn Harper collapsed into the arms of the wrong man while carrying the child of the one she truly loved. The wedding took place on a grey February morning beneath a sky so colourless and heavy that the entire town of Bar Harbour seemed suspended inside a world drained of warmth, as though even nature itself understood. This was not the kind of day people later remembered with joy. Snow lined the sidewalks in uneven frozen piles, darkened by ash and sea-water, while bitter Atlantic winds swept through the narrow streets hard enough to force churchgoers to lower their heads as they hurried towards St. Andrew's Chapel, wrapped tightly inside wool coats and scarves. Inside the church, candles flickered softly against stained glass windows, while the scent of old wood, melting snow, and dying fireplace embers filled the air with the quiet heaviness of winter. Everything looked beautiful, and absolutely none of it felt real to Evelyn Harper. She stood alone inside the small dressing room near the back of the chapel, while her mother carefully adjusted the sleeves of her ivory wedding dress with trembling hands, though whether those hands trembled from guilt, fear, or relief, neither woman would ever say aloud. The mirror reflected someone Evelyn barely recognized. Her face looked pale beneath the lace veil. Her eyes looked older, not physically, spiritually. Like the girl she had once been only months earlier, had disappeared somewhere between the lighthouse and the telegram announcing Thomas Reed's death. "You need a little lipstick," her mother whispered softly, while avoiding direct eye contact. Evelyn stared silently at her own reflection. "I can still leave," she said quietly. The words hung in the room like smoke. Her mother froze completely behind her. Outside, distant church bells echoed faintly through the storm. "No," her mother finally answered without emotion. "You can't." Evelyn lowered her eyes slowly toward her stomach, hidden beneath layers of satin and lace, and for one unbearable moment she imagined what would happen if she ran now, if she simply opened the church door and disappeared into the snow-covered streets without explanation, without permission, without caring what happened afterward. But reality crushed the fantasy almost instantly. Thomas was gone. Her child still needed protection. And the world she lived in did not forgive women who chose scandal over survival. So instead, she remained perfectly still while her mother fastened the pearl necklace around her throat, like the final clasp on a life she no longer recognized as her own. The ceremony itself passed like a dream someone else was having. Evelyn barely remembered walking down the aisle, barely remembered the music, barely remembered the faces turning toward her from crowded wooden pews filled with smiling relatives and neighbors who whispered approvingly about how beautiful she looked beside Richard Harper, the respectable young businessman every mother in town wished her daughter could marry. Only certain fragments remained sharp in her memory afterward. The sound of wind rattling the stained glass windows, the smell of Richard's cologne as he gently held her shaking hands, the way her father avoided looking directly at her throughout the ceremony, and most of all, the unbearable silence inside herself when the minister asked whether she took Richard Harper to be her husband. Because standing there beneath candlelight while snowstorm shadows moved across the chapel walls, Evelyn suddenly understood something terrifying. Grief was not loud the way people imagined. Sometimes grief was quiet enough to disguise itself as obedience. "I do," she whispered, and somewhere deep inside her, something closed forever. Richard kissed her softly after the ceremony, while guests applauded politely, and for a brief moment Evelyn almost hated him for being kind, because cruelty would have made everything easier. But Richard remained gentle, attentive, patient. He guided her carefully through conversations during the reception, while jazz records played softly through the church hall, and older women complimented the wedding cake and discussed future grandchildren with cheerful certainty. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat smiling faintly beside a man she barely knew while carrying another man's child and mourning another man's death. The emotional exhaustion became almost unbearable. At one point during dinner, she excused herself quietly and stepped outside alone into the freezing snow-covered churchyard, desperate for air, desperate for silence, desperate for anything untouched by lies. The storm had weakened slightly by then. Snowflakes drifted softly beneath glowing streetlights, while the Atlantic roared invisibly somewhere beyond town. Evelyn wrapped her coat tightly around herself and closed her eyes. Then suddenly she heard footsteps behind her. "Richard, you're freezing," he said gently while placing his coat over her shoulders. For a moment neither of them spoke. Snow settled quietly around them. Finally Richard looked toward the dark coastline. "You know," he said softly, "I always imagined you'd be happier on our wedding day." Evelyn's breath caught instantly. Slowly she turned toward him. His expression remained calm, careful, but something in his eyes had changed, something observant, something wounded, and in that terrifying moment, Evelyn realized Richard Harper was not nearly as blind as everyone believed. Spring arrived late that year. The snow melted slowly along the harbour, while grey rainstorms rolled endlessly across coastal Maine, and inside the Harper house, Evelyn drifted through her new marriage like a ghost haunting someone else's life. Richard remained patient despite the growing emotional distance between them. Too patient. Sometimes she caught him watching her quietly during dinner, as though trying to solve a puzzle whose answer frightened him. And as Evelyn's pregnancy advanced faster than expected, those silent observations became increasingly difficult to ignore. By late summer, whispers had already begun circulating quietly among older women at church. The baby was arriving early, too early. One humid August evening, while thunder rolled faintly over the ocean and rain pressed heavily against the bedroom windows, Evelyn went into labour nearly 6 weeks ahead of schedule. The pain arrived violently, suddenly. Richard rushed her through storm-covered streets toward the small local hospital, while lightning flashed across the harbour, and radio announcers warned fishermen to return to shore immediately. Hours later, exhausted beyond comprehension, Evelyn finally held her newborn son against her chest while dawn slowly brightened the rain-covered windows behind her. The child had Thomas's eyes. The realization struck her with devastating force. Richard stood silently near the hospital bed, staring at the baby with unreadable expression. Then his gaze slowly shifted toward Evelyn, and though he said nothing, she understood instantly. He knew, maybe not everything, but enough to begin unraveling the truth. 3 weeks later, while Evelyn rocked the baby quietly beside the fireplace during another rainy coastal evening, Richard entered the living room, carrying something in his hand. An envelope, old, worn. Her blood turned cold immediately. "I found this inside one of your books," he said quietly. Thomas's handwriting stared back at her from across the room. "Forever yours, Thomas." The baby stirred softly in Evelyn's arms as panic surged violently through her chest. Richard looked at the letter for several long seconds before speaking again. Who was he? Outside, thunder shook the windows, and for the first time since Thomas Reed disappeared from her life, Evelyn Harper realized the past had not buried itself nearly as deeply as she once hoped. Years passed the way they often do inside unhappy lives, quietly, quickly, and with such repetitive sameness that entire decades seemed to dissolve into one long blur of family dinners, sleepless nights, changing seasons, and words left permanently unspoken. From the outside, the Harper family looked almost painfully perfect. Richard's business prospered steadily throughout the 1960s and 70s, allowing them to move into a larger coastal home overlooking the Atlantic, where neighbours admired Evelyn's flower gardens in spring and complimented the warmth of her kitchen during holiday gatherings each winter. Their son grew into a polite, intelligent young man. Photographs accumulated across hallway walls. Christmas mornings became traditions. Birthdays arrived and disappeared. Eventually, grandchildren filled the house with noise and life and temporary relief from memory. And through all of it, Evelyn mastered the exhausting art of pretending she was happy, pretending she had forgotten, pretending Thomas Reed existed only as a tragic youthful mistake buried somewhere far behind her. But grief does not disappear simply because people refuse to discuss it. Real grief becomes quieter, sharper. It settles inside ordinary moments, waiting patiently for small things to awaken it again. A song on the radio, a familiar smell, a winter storm against the windows, or handwriting, always the handwriting, because despite everything, despite the telegram, despite the marriage, despite the years of silence, the letters never truly stopped coming. The first arrived less than 6 months after her wedding. It appeared inside the mailbox on an ordinary rainy Tuesday afternoon while Richard was away handling business in Portland, and the baby slept upstairs beside the nursery window. Evelyn almost ignored it at first, until she recognized the handwriting. Her entire body went numb. For several seconds she simply stared at the envelope while rainwater dripped from her coat onto the kitchen floor. Impossible. Her hands trembled so violently she nearly tore the paper while opening it. Inside was only one page. "Evelyn, if this letter reaches you, then at least I know you're alive too. I tried coming back. They told me you married him. I didn't know what else to do. I'm sorry. Thomas Evelyn reread the letter 5 times before the meaning fully settled into her consciousness. Alive. Thomas was alive. The telegram had been false. The room tilted around her. She sank slowly into a kitchen chair while rain battered the windows, and somewhere upstairs her baby cried softly through the monitor. Thomas had not abandoned her. Thomas had not died. Someone had lied, and suddenly every sacrifice she had made, every compromise, every sleepless night, every lonely year beside Richard, transformed instantly into something unbearable, because none of it had been necessary. For weeks, Evelyn lived in constant terror that Richard would discover the letter, but strangely he never searched for it, never questioned her behaviour, never mentioned Thomas again after that first confrontation beside the fireplace months earlier. Instead, something even more unsettling happened. Richard became gentler, more attentive, as though he understood she carried some permanent invisible wound he could never heal, but had somehow chosen to live beside anyway. Sometimes late at night, Evelyn would wake to find him sitting alone downstairs in darkness, smoking silently beside the ocean-facing windows. And though neither of them ever spoke honestly about the child, or the letters, or the growing emptiness between them, a strange quiet understanding slowly formed inside the marriage. Not romantic love, not passion, something sadder, mutual loneliness. The letters continued across decades. Sometimes two arrived in 1 year, sometimes none arrived for months. Thomas never pressured her to respond, never begged her to leave, never accused her. Instead, he wrote about ordinary things, roads he travelled, cities he lived in, jazz clubs in Chicago, ocean sunsets in California, the loneliness of hotel rooms, books he thought she would love, memories he could not forget, and hidden between every line was the quiet, devastating truth that he had loved her for the rest of his life. Evelyn kept every letter, even after promising herself countless times she would burn them all. She stored them inside wooden boxes tied carefully with faded ribbon and carried them secretly from house to house whenever the family moved over the years, preserving them like pieces of another life she had never stopped mourning. Then, one winter evening in 1983, a final letter arrived. By then, Evelyn's hair had already begun turning silver. Her grandchildren were toddlers. The world itself felt different, older, faster, colder. The envelope looked thinner than usual, more fragile somehow, and unlike every previous letter, this one frightened her immediately, because on the back corner Thomas had written only 3 words, "For the end." Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, staring at the envelope while snow fell softly beyond the darkened windows. Something inside her already knew opening it would change everything. Maybe destroy the fragile balance her life had managed to build over decades of silence. So finally, with trembling hands and tears already forming in her eyes, Evelyn made the cowardly choice she would regret for the next 40 years. She never opened it. Instead, she placed the unopened envelope at the bottom of the wooden box beneath all the others, tied the ribbon carefully closed, and carried the secret upstairs into the attic, where memory could sleep undisturbed a little longer. Or at least that was what she desperately hoped. Because some truths, no matter how deeply buried, spend entire lifetimes waiting patiently to return. The storm lingering over Bar Harbor refused to leave for almost 3 straight days, wrapping the coastline in cold fog and endless rain, while waves hammered the cliffs below the Harper house with such relentless force that the windows trembled softly throughout the night, like something alive breathing against the glass. Inside the old house, silence had begun spreading through the rooms in strange, uncomfortable ways. Not peaceful silence, not ordinary quiet. This was the kind of silence created when people sense the shape of a truth approaching, but are still too afraid to look directly at it. Ever since discovering the letters in the attic, Claire Bennet could no longer see her grandmother the same way. Every familiar detail suddenly carried new meaning. The way Evelyn drifted absent-mindedly toward the ocean-facing windows whenever storms arrived. The sadness hidden beneath her soft smile, the carefully preserved boxes of photographs, even the old jazz records stacked beside the living-room radio now felt less like random nostalgia and more like pieces of a secret life hidden in plain sight for decades. Claire barely slept that week, and because she had spent most of her adult life as a journalist trained to follow inconsistencies until they surrendered answers, her instincts eventually overpowered her hesitation. If Thomas Reed had truly died in 1960, then why had letters continued arriving for more than 20 years afterward? Someone had lied. The question now was who and why. On Thursday morning, Claire drove into town alone beneath heavy grey skies, while freezing rain drifted across the windshield in slow silver streaks, and although Bar Harbor looked almost exactly as she remembered from childhood visits, the same weathered storefronts, the same fishing docks, the same narrow streets smelling faintly of salt water and coffee, the town suddenly felt transformed by the possibility that its history contained secrets buried beneath decades of polite silence. Her first stop was the local newspaper archive housed inside a small brick building near Main Street, where ancient filing cabinets lined the walls beside shelves overflowing with yellowed newspapers dating back nearly a century. An elderly archivist named Margaret recognized Claire immediately. "You're Evelyn Harper's granddaughter, aren't you?" Claire smiled politely. "I am." Margaret adjusted her glasses while studying her curiously. "Your grandmother was one of the prettiest girls in this town back in the day." Something about the comment unsettled Claire unexpectedly, because people rarely spoke about Evelyn as though she once belonged to another life entirely. Claire removed a folded note from her coat pocket. "I'm looking for information about someone named Thomas Reed." The archivist froze almost imperceptibly, just for a second, but Claire noticed. Margaret's expression shifted carefully into neutrality. "Well," she murmured slowly, "that's a name I haven't heard in a very long time." Claire's pulse quickened immediately. "So you knew him?" Margaret hesitated, then quietly replied, "Everybody knew Thomas Reed." The room suddenly felt smaller. Claire leaned slightly closer across the desk. I was told he died in 1960. Margaret's silence lasted too long. Finally she stood and walked slowly toward the back archive shelves while rain tapped steadily against the old windows. "You didn't hear this from me," she said quietly over her shoulder, "but some people around here never believe that story." Claire's heartbeat accelerated. "What do you mean?" Margaret returned, carrying a thin newspaper folder covered in dust. Inside were several articles. One headline immediately caught Claire's attention. "Local man presumed dead after winter road accident." Claire quickly scanned the article. Thomas Reed. Vehicle discovered abandoned outside Bangor during snowstorm. No body recovered. Authorities suspect fatal exposure. Claire frowned immediately. Presumed dead, not confirmed dead. "That's it?" Claire asked quietly. "No funeral?" Margaret shook her head. "No body, no burial." People asked questions at first, but eventually life moved on. Claire stared down at the article while unease spread through her chest like ice water. Then Margaret lowered her voice further. "There were rumours, though." Claire looked up instantly. "What kind of rumours?" The older woman hesitated again before answering carefully. "That certain influential families in town wanted Thomas Reed gone." Claire's breath caught. Influential families, like the Harpers. Outside thunder rolled faintly over the harbour. By late afternoon Claire sat alone inside a small diner overlooking the marina, while stacks of copied newspaper articles covered the table around her untouched coffee cup. The deeper she searched, the stranger the story became. Thomas Reed had disappeared abruptly. No body had ever been found, and yet somehow the entire town accepted his death almost immediately, as though people had wanted the story to be true. Claire rubbed her tired eyes and leaned back against the booth. Then suddenly another detail from the attic returned sharply to her memory. The dates on the letters, long after Thomas supposedly died. Her stomach tightened. Slowly, Claire removed one of the copied articles from the pile again. Richard Harper's name appeared twice within local business sections during the same months Thomas disappeared, and for the first time an impossible thought entered her mind. What if Richard knew? The idea seemed absurd, terrifying, yet somehow increasingly unavoidable. That evening Claire returned to the Harper house just after sunset, while violent wind rattled tree branches along the driveway and ocean mist rolled heavily across the cliffs below the property. Inside, Daniel sat at the piano quietly playing old jazz melodies beneath dim living room light, while Evelyn knitted silently near the fireplace. The scene looked peaceful at first glance, almost painfully normal, but Claire no longer trusted appearances inside this family. She removed her coat slowly. "Grandma," she said carefully, "I went into town today." Evelyn's knitting needle stopped moving instantly. Daniel glanced up from the piano. Claire stepped further into the room. "I found newspaper archives about Thomas Reed." Silence swallowed the room whole. Even the fire seemed quieter. Evelyn lowered her eyes slowly toward her lap. Claire's voice softened slightly. "You told everyone he died." Evelyn whispered without looking up. "That's what I believed." "But he didn't." The words landed heavily. Daniel turned fully toward them now, confusion growing across his face. What are you talking about? Claire looked at him carefully, then back at Evelyn. The telegram was false. Daniel stared in disbelief. What telegram? Evelyn finally looked up, and Claire saw something terrifying in her grandmother's eyes. Not fear any more, exhaustion. The exhaustion of carrying unbearable truth for too many years. Then Claire spoke the question that had been haunting her all day. Did Grandpa know Thomas was alive? For several seconds Evelyn said absolutely nothing, and that silence became answer enough. Daniel slowly stood from the piano. What the hell is happening here? Nobody answered immediately, because suddenly the entire foundation of their family no longer felt stable. Later that night, unable to sleep, Claire returned once more to the attic, carrying a flashlight, while storm winds groaned through the old house around her. She opened the wooden boxes again carefully, sorting through decades of letters beneath the weak beam of light. Then suddenly something slipped free from between two envelopes and landed softly beside her knee. A photograph. Claire picked it up slowly. At first glance it appeared ordinary. A summer picnic sometime during the late 1960s. Richard Harper stood smiling beside Evelyn, while a small dark-haired boy sat between them in the grass. Claire's breath caught. The child looked exactly like Thomas Reed. Not vaguely similar, identical. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same expression. Claire stared at the photograph while cold realization spread through her body. Then quietly, almost afraid to hear the words aloud, she whispered, "Oh my God," because suddenly she understood. Someone in this family was never truly a Harper. The next morning arrived beneath dark storm clouds and crashing waves so violent that Coast Guard sirens echoed faintly across the harbour before sunrise, warning fishing boats to remain ashore until conditions improved. While inside the Harper house, the atmosphere had grown so tense and emotionally fragile that even ordinary sounds, clinking dishes, footsteps across wooden floors, rain tapping windows, seemed unbearably loud. Claire barely slept after discovering the photograph. She spent most of the night sitting awake beside the attic window, staring toward the invisible ocean, while the truth slowly assembled itself, piece by piece, inside her mind, like a puzzle she desperately wished remained unsolved. Thomas Reed had not died. Evelyn knew. Richard probably knew. And somewhere buried beneath decades of silence existed a secret large enough to reshape the entire history of their family. Downstairs she could hear movement in the kitchen shortly after dawn, cabinet doors opening softly, the whistle of a kettle, the quiet familiar rhythms of Evelyn beginning another morning, despite the emotional collapse steadily approaching around her. Claire descended slowly. The kitchen glowed with pale grey morning light, while rain streaked the windows, and jazz music drifted quietly from the old radio near the refrigerator. Evelyn stood alone beside the stove, stirring oatmeal mechanically, though her exhausted expression suggested she had not slept either. For several moments neither woman spoke. Then Claire placed the old photograph gently onto the kitchen table. Evelyn froze instantly. The wooden spoon slipped slightly in her hand. "Where did you find that?" "In the attic." The silence that followed felt crushing. Evelyn lowered herself slowly into a chair, as though her legs no longer trusted their own strength. Claire sat across from her carefully. "I know about Thomas." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Outside wind rattled the windows violently. "And I think I know something else too." When Evelyn looked up again, tears already shimmered faintly in her tired eyes. Claire's voice became almost a whisper. Who was his child? The question shattered whatever fragile emotional walls Evelyn had managed to maintain for decades. Her face crumpled instantly, not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly collapsing beneath the unbearable weight of memory. "Oh God," she whispered shakily. Claire reached forward instinctively. "Grandma." "I tried so hard to protect everyone," Evelyn said suddenly, her voice trembling uncontrollably now. "You have to understand that." "Then help me understand." Evelyn looked toward the storm-darkened ocean beyond the kitchen windows, as though searching for courage somewhere far away in the past. Finally she spoke. "It was your father." Claire stopped breathing. The room seemed to tilt sideways beneath her. "No." Evelyn nodded once slowly, while tears slid silently down her face. "Yes." Claire pushed back from the table immediately, horrified disbelief surging through her chest. "No, that's impossible." But even while saying it, she already knew, because suddenly decades of small forgotten details rearranged themselves with devastating clarity. Her father's eyes, his appearance, the strange distance Richard sometimes carried around him during family gatherings, the sadness hidden inside Evelyn whenever old jazz music played. Daniel entered the kitchen at that exact moment, carrying firewood from outside, only to stop abruptly after seeing Claire's expression. "What happened?" Claire looked at him numbly, then back at Evelyn. "Grandpa wasn't my biological grandfather." The words hung in the kitchen like broken glass. Daniel stared in confusion. "What?" Evelyn covered her face with trembling hands. For several seconds nobody moved. Rain hammered the windows harder. Finally, Daniel stepped forward slowly. "Grandma, what is she talking about?" Evelyn lowered her hands carefully, and when she spoke again, her voice sounded older than Claire had ever heard before. "I loved Thomas Reed before I married Richard." Daniel frowned, still struggling to understand. "But Thomas died." "No," Claire whispered. "He didn't." Daniel looked between them both in disbelief, while realization slowly spread across his face. "Oh my God." Evelyn's breathing became uneven now. "I thought he was dead," she whispered desperately. "I swear to you, I believed the telegram." "But he wrote to you for years," Claire said sharply. "Yes, and you never told anyone. What was I supposed to do?" Evelyn suddenly cried, decades of buried emotion finally breaking free all at once. Destroy the family? Humiliate Richard after everything he sacrificed for us? The pain in her voice silenced the room instantly. Even Claire's anger faltered slightly, because for the first time she saw not simply a woman who lied, but a woman who had spent 60 years trapped inside consequences she never fully chose. Evelyn wiped tears from her face shakily. "You think people today understand what the world was like back then?" she whispered. "Women lost everything over scandals like this. Families were destroyed. Children carried shame their entire lives." Daniel sat down slowly beside the table, pale and speechless. Claire remained standing, still angry, still hurt. But now something else had entered the emotion too, sympathy, and somehow that made everything even harder. Then Evelyn looked toward both of them with an expression so full of exhaustion and grief that for one terrible moment she seemed every day of her 78 years. "There's still more you don't know," she whispered. And outside the house, somewhere beyond the cliffs, disappearing into storm fog, a lighthouse beam swept slowly across the dark Atlantic, like a warning from another lifetime still refusing to let them go. That night, the storm finally reached its full, terrifying strength, arriving along the coast with the kind of violence only late autumn Atlantic weather could unleash, as if the ocean itself had grown restless after decades of silence and had finally decided to drag every buried secret back toward the surface. Wind screamed around the harbour house hard enough to bend the old cedar trees overlooking the cliffs, while rain lashed endlessly against the windows in silver sheets, and thunder rolled across the harbour with such deep trembling force that the glass inside the kitchen cabinets rattled softly every few minutes. Inside the house, however, the true storm unfolding had nothing to do with weather, because after Evelyn's confession that morning, nobody seemed capable of pretending normal life still existed. Dinner remained untouched on the stove. The radio stayed silent. Even the old grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly sounded unbearable, its slow, steady ticking echoing through the house like time itself, counting down towards something inevitable. Claire spent most of the evening sitting near the living room fireplace, wrapped inside a wool blanket, while staring blankly at the flames, unable to fully process the realization that the man she had called Grandpa her entire life had knowingly raised another man's child without ever revealing the truth. Daniel drifted quietly between rooms in emotional shock, occasionally pausing beside family photographs lining the hallway walls, as though trying to identify the exact moment their entire history transformed into something unfamiliar. And Evelyn remained in the kitchen alone for nearly 2 hours after sunset, sitting motionless beside the darkened window while one unopened letter rested on the table in front of her like a loaded weapon nobody dared touch. The final letter, the one she had hidden for over 40 years, the one marked for the end. Eventually, Claire entered the kitchen softly, her footsteps barely audible beneath the storm outside. For a long moment, she simply stood there watching her grandmother. Evelyn looked impossibly fragile tonight, her silver hair slightly dishevelled, her tired hands wrapped tightly around a cold teacup she no longer seemed aware she was holding. And despite everything Claire had learned over the past 24 hours, despite the lies, despite the secrets, despite the anger still lingering painfully inside her chest, seeing Evelyn like this awakened something deeply human beneath the betrayal. Pity. Not pity in a cruel sense, but the heartbreaking realization that this woman had spent most of her life carrying grief completely alone. Claire pulled out the chair opposite her and sat quietly, Neither woman spoke at first. Rain hammered the roof overhead. Finally, Claire looked toward the unopened envelope. "You never read it?" Evelyn shook her head slowly. "I was afraid." "Of what?" The old woman stared toward the storm-darkened ocean beyond the window. "That if I opened it," she whispered, "then I'd finally have to admit I never stopped loving him." The honesty of the sentence settled heavily between them. Claire lowered her eyes. "Grandma, I know what you think of me now." Claire immediately looked up. Evelyn smiled sadly. "You should know I spent many years thinking the same things about myself." The room fell silent again. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel entered carrying firewood. Though one glance at the atmosphere told him instantly this moment mattered. He slowly placed the wood beside the fireplace and looked toward the envelope. "That's the last letter?" he asked quietly. Evelyn nodded. Daniel swallowed hard. Then, after several long seconds, he spoke the words none of them were prepared for. "I think it's time." Outside, lightning flashed across the ocean cliffs. And finally, after 43 years of silence, Evelyn Harper reached trembling fingers toward the envelope she had feared almost half her life. The paper had grown fragile with age, yellowed, soft around the edges. Evelyn's hands shook so violently that Claire eventually reached across the table and gently helped steady the letter while thunder rolled across the coastline beyond the windows. Then slowly, carefully, Evelyn opened it. The room became perfectly still. Even the storm seemed distant now. Evelyn unfolded the letter and began reading. "My Evelyn, if you're reading this, then one of two things has happened. Either you finally found the courage to open the envelope, or time has finally run out for both of us. I suppose I deserve that uncertainty after all these years. First, you should know something I should have said long ago. I never blamed you, not once, not for marrying him, not for staying, not for surviving the only way you knew how." The words blurred instantly through Evelyn's tears. Claire felt her own chest tighten painfully, while Daniel stared silently at the table. Outside, rain battered the windows harder. Evelyn continued reading shakily. "The truth is, Richard came to see me before your wedding. He found me outside Bangor after the accident. I wasn't dead. I was drunk, angry, and halfway frozen in the snow when he pulled over his car beside the road. And God help me, I think he already knew about the baby before either of us said a word." Claire's breath caught sharply. Evelyn stopped reading momentarily, visibly shaken. Daniel whispered, "He knew from the beginning." Evelyn nodded faintly through tears and continued, "He offered me money to disappear, but not because he hated me. That's the part you deserve to understand before I die. He loved you, enough to do something impossible, enough to raise another man's child rather than destroy your life, enough to sacrifice his own happiness so the town would never tear you apart. I hated him for that at first. Then eventually I realized he might have loved you almost as much as I did." Silence swallowed the kitchen. Claire covered her mouth with trembling fingers, because suddenly Richard Harper no longer felt like the villain in the story. He felt tragic, almost unbearably tragic. Evelyn's tears fell freely now onto the paper while she forced herself onward. I came back once, you probably never knew. It was the summer of 1974. I stood across the street outside the grocery store and watched you carrying your son's hand while Richard walked beside you. You looked happy, or at least peaceful. And I realized something then. Sometimes love means leaving before your presence ruins the only life the other person managed to build. So I left again, but I never stopped loving you. Not for one day, not for one single day. The kitchen had become so quiet that the sound of the storm felt impossibly far away now, as though all three of them had slipped backward through time into the aching emotional space between memory and regret. Evelyn reached the final line slowly. When my time comes, I hope the ocean is loud enough that somewhere in another life you'll still hear me calling your name beside the lighthouse. Forever yours, Thomas. For several seconds after finishing, Evelyn simply sat frozen, while tears slid silently down her face, and the letter trembled weakly in her hands beneath the dim kitchen light. Then suddenly she broke, not elegantly, not quietly, but completely. 60 years of grief collapsed out of her all at once as she lowered her head into her trembling hands and sobbed with the heartbreaking devastation of someone finally allowing herself to mourn the life she lost. And neither Claire nor Daniel knew what to do except sit beside her while the storm raged endlessly outside. The truth did not emerge all at once after that. Instead, it arrived slowly throughout the following day, piece by painful piece, like old bones surfacing from beneath years of shifting ocean tides, until eventually the entire hidden history of the Harper family stood exposed beneath cold grey morning light, with nowhere left to hide. The storm had weakened overnight, though heavy fog still blanketed the coastline so thickly that the ocean itself disappeared completely beyond the cliffs, leaving only the distant sound of crashing waves somewhere inside the whiteness like ghosts moving through memory. Evelyn barely slept. Neither did Claire. At sunrise, the old house felt emotionally exhausted, as though decades of silence had soaked permanently into the walls themselves. Daniel brewed coffee quietly while Claire sat at the kitchen table rereading Thomas's final letter over and over again, each sentence reshaping everything she thought she understood about love, loyalty, and sacrifice. Because the most shocking part was no longer that Evelyn lied. It was that Richard Harper had chosen to help her carry the lie, not out of cruelty, not out of manipulation, but out of love, and somehow that made the story infinitely sadder. Evelyn eventually entered the kitchen, wearing the same pale blue cardigan from the night before, her eyes swollen from crying, while exhaustion settled heavily across her face like physical weight. For several moments nobody spoke. Then Claire finally asked the question haunting all of them. Did Grandpa ever tell you why he really helped? Evelyn lowered herself slowly into the chair beside the window. Outside, fog pressed heavily against the glass. He said the town would destroy me if the truth came out, she whispered, and he was right. Daniel frowned slightly. But why would he stay after that? Evelyn smiled sadly toward her untouched tea. Because Richard Harper loved impossible things. The sentence lingered quietly in the room. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, Evelyn began telling them everything she had hidden for more than 60 years. After receiving the telegram announcing Thomas's supposed death, Evelyn had believed her entire future collapsed overnight. What she never knew at the time was that Richard Harper himself became suspicious almost immediately after hearing the story. The abandoned car, no body, no witnesses, too many unanswered questions. And according to Evelyn, Richard eventually confessed years later that he never truly believed Thomas Reed died in that snowstorm. He found him 3 days afterward, Evelyn said softly while staring toward the fog outside Bangor near a roadside motel. Claire's pulse quickened. Thomas was alive the entire time. Evelyn nodded, half frozen, drunk, angry, completely heartbroken. Daniel leaned forward slowly, and Grandpa just paid him to disappear. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. It wasn't that simple. According to Richard's confession many years later, he initially confronted Thomas, intending only to warn him to stay away from Evelyn permanently. But once the truth about the pregnancy emerged, everything changed, because suddenly Richard understood the reality of what would happen if the affair became public. In 1960, scandal in small-town America spread like wildfire and never truly disappeared. Evelyn would become a disgrace. Her child would grow up carrying whispers and humiliation, and both families would spend decades trapped beneath judgment. So Richard made a decision, Evelyn whispered. What kind of decision? Claire asked carefully. Evelyn's eyes filled slowly with tears again. He decided to become the villain so the rest of us could survive. The room fell silent. Outside, a foghorn echoed faintly somewhere near the harbour. Evelyn explained how Richard gave Thomas enough money to leave Maine and start over somewhere far away. But according to Thomas's letters, the arrangement had never truly been about greed or intimidation. It had been about sacrifice. Thomas left because he believed Evelyn deserved stability. Richard stayed because he believed Evelyn deserved protection. And Evelyn herself remained trapped forever between two men who both loved her enough to destroy their own happiness. It sounds impossible, Daniel murmured quietly. No, Evelyn whispered. It sounds lonely. The deeper Evelyn spoke, the more Claire realized her grandparents' marriage had never resembled the simple, comfortable family story everyone else imagined. Richard and Evelyn eventually built affection, respect, partnership, but beneath all of it lived a permanent, quiet sadness neither of them fully escaped. He knew your father wasn't biologically his, Evelyn said softly while looking toward Claire, but he loved him anyway. Claire felt tears burn suddenly behind her eyes. All those years, Evelyn nodded. Richard attended every baseball game, every graduation, every birthday. He taught your father how to drive, helped him buy his first suit. Her voice trembled slightly, and never once treated him differently. Claire lowered her gaze immediately, overwhelmed by emotion too complicated to name, because suddenly her entire understanding of family felt transformed. Blood no longer seemed like the most important thing. Love did, sacrifice did, choice did, Then Daniel quietly asked the question none of them truly wanted answered. Did Grandpa ever regret staying? Evelyn looked toward the ocean. For a very long time she said nothing. Finally she whispered, "Only when he thought I couldn't hear him crying at night." The sentence shattered something inside the room completely. Claire covered her eyes. Daniel looked away toward the darkened hallway, and Evelyn sat silently beside the fog-covered window while the full unbearable weight of an entire lifetime settled around them all at once, because sometimes the deepest tragedies are not built from hatred. Sometimes they are built from love stretched too far for human hearts to survive intact. For the first time in decades, the Harper house no longer felt like a home protected by routine and tradition, but rather like an old ship caught in violent waters after hidden cracks beneath the surface had finally split open beyond repair, allowing years of silence, resentment, grief, and unfinished love to flood every room all at once. The fog lingering over Bar Harbor that morning felt almost suffocating in its heaviness, swallowing the coastline completely so that the ocean itself became invisible beyond the windows, leaving only the endless distant sound of waves crashing somewhere inside the whiteness like ghosts refusing to rest. Inside the house, emotional exhaustion hung in the air so thickly that even breathing seemed difficult. Claire had spent most of the afternoon alone upstairs, inside the guest bedroom, where childhood photographs still lined the shelves beside faded books and old quilts, smelling faintly of cedar and lavender. And although part of her desperately wanted to leave the house, drive back to Boston, and escape the emotional wreckage consuming the family, another part of her understood with painful clarity that nothing inside her life would ever feel simple again after learning the truth. Because the real devastation was no longer the affair itself. It was the realization that almost every adult she had trusted growing up had spent decades protecting a version of reality that never truly existed. Her grandfather had lied, her grandmother had lied, the town had lied. Even family memories now felt unstable, and somewhere beneath all that confusion lived a quieter, more personal pain Claire had not yet fully admitted aloud. If Richard Harper was not truly her biological grandfather, then who exactly had she been grieving all these years since his death? The question hollowed something inside her. Downstairs, Daniel sat alone near the piano, staring absently at old family photographs spread across the coffee table, while rain drifted softly against the windows and jazz music played low through the ancient radio beside the fireplace. He looked emotionally shattered, not angry in the sharp, explosive way Claire felt, just heartbroken. Because unlike Claire, Daniel had always viewed Evelyn as the emotional center of the family, the one person who made every holiday feel warm and safe, no matter how difficult life became outside the walls of the Harper house, and now even that certainty had cracked. Evelyn entered the living room quietly, carrying folded blankets, though one glance at Daniel's expression made her stop almost immediately. "What is it?" she asked softly. Daniel picked up one of the photographs slowly, a Christmas picture from 1978. Richard stood smiling beside the tree while Evelyn laughed at something outside the frame. They looked happy, painfully happy, Was any of it real? Daniel asked quietly. The question struck Evelyn harder than anger would have. She lowered herself slowly into the armchair beside him. Yes, she whispered immediately. Daniel looked at her with tears gathering in his eyes. How can you say that? Because love can still be real, even when people are hurting. Daniel shook his head slowly. But Grandpa spent his whole life pretending. Evelyn's face crumpled slightly. No, she whispered. Richard spent his life choosing us. The sentence lingered heavily in the room. Then Claire descended the staircase, and immediately the fragile peace shattered. You don't get to romanticize this anymore, Claire said sharply while crossing the living room. You lie to everyone. Evelyn looked down. I know. You let Grandpa raise another man's child while the entire town believed a fake story. I was trying to survive. Claire laughed bitterly. No, Grandma, you were hiding. Daniel stood immediately. Claire? No, she snapped, turning toward him now. Stop defending this. Rain intensified suddenly outside. The old house groaned beneath rising wind. Claire's voice shook with years of buried emotion she hadn't even realized existed. Do you understand what this does to people? My father spent his entire life not knowing who he really was. Evelyn's eyes filled instantly. I wanted to tell him, but you didn't, because I was afraid. Claire stepped closer. You were always afraid. The words landed with brutal precision. Evelyn physically recoiled as though struck. Daniel moved between them immediately. That's enough. No, it isn't enough, Claire fired back. Everyone in this family keeps calling this sacrifice, but maybe it was just cowardice. Silence exploded across the room. Even Claire seemed shocked by the cruelty of her own words. Evelyn lowered her gaze slowly toward her trembling hands, and when she finally spoke again, her voice sounded unbearably small. You may be right. The sadness in those words instantly drained the anger from the room, but the damage had already been done. That evening the storm returned violently. By sunset, waves crashed against the cliffs with terrifying force, while Coast Guard sirens echoed across the harbour, warning residents to remain indoors. Claire locked herself inside the guest room, overcome with guilt after the argument. Evelyn sat silently beside the kitchen window, staring toward the invisible ocean, and Daniel disappeared. At first nobody noticed. Not until nearly an hour passed. Then 2. Claire finally descended downstairs just after 9 o'clock. Where's Daniel? Evelyn looked up slowly from the table. Fear immediately spread across her face. His coat was gone. So were his keys. Outside, rain hammered the windows almost sideways beneath screaming wind. Claire's stomach dropped. Oh, God! Evelyn stood too quickly, nearly losing balance. He wouldn't... But neither of them finished the sentence, because both already knew exactly where Daniel had gone. The lighthouse. The road leading toward the lighthouse had nearly disappeared beneath floodwater and storm debris by the time Claire finally forced Evelyn's old station wagon through the coastal highway, while rain slashed violently across the windshield, and waves exploded against black cliffs below with enough force to shake the entire coastline. Inside the car, neither woman spoke much. The windshield wipers moved frantically back and forth while distant lighthouse beams swept intermittently through the storm fog ahead, like ghostly warnings cutting through darkness. Claire gripped the steering wheel tightly. Beside her, Evelyn looked pale with fear. He used to go there when he was upset as a teenager, she whispered softly over the sound of the storm. Richard would always find him sitting near the cliffs. The mention of Richard's name hurt now, in an entirely different way than before. Not because Claire hated him any more, but because she suddenly realized how much invisible emotional labor the man had carried for decades without asking for recognition from anyone. The thought made her chest ache. By the time they reached the lighthouse parking area, rain had weakened slightly, though violent wind still screamed across the cliffs hard enough to nearly tear the car doors from their hinges. Claire spotted Daniel immediately. He sat alone near the edge of the rocky overlook, wearing a soaked wool coat, while lighthouse beams moved rhythmically across the ocean behind him, and several old letters rested open beside him beneath the rain. For one horrifying second, Claire thought he might step closer toward the cliff edge. "Daniel!" she shouted over the wind. He turned slowly. His face looked exhausted, not reckless, not unstable, just emotionally broken open. Claire and Evelyn hurried toward him carefully against the storm, while waves crashed violently below the rocks beneath them. Daniel looked down at the letters scattered around him. "I brought them with me," he said quietly. "I needed to understand." Evelyn's breathing trembled in the cold air. Daniel picked up one of Thomas's letters slowly. "I spent 3 hours reading these." The lighthouse beam swept across them again, illuminating tears mixed with rainwater on his face. "He loved you his entire life." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "Yes." Daniel laughed softly beneath the storm. "You know the strange part?" he whispered. "I don't even think this story is about betrayal anymore." Claire looked at him carefully. Daniel stared out toward the black ocean. "I think it's about loneliness." The words settled heavily between them. Then he looked toward Evelyn. "You had 2 men willing to sacrifice everything for you." His voice cracked slightly. "And somehow all 3 of you still ended up miserable." Evelyn began crying quietly, not dramatic sobbing, just exhausted tears carried away by ocean wind. Daniel stepped closer to her slowly. "I was angry before," he admitted, "but after reading the letters," he looked toward the crashing waves below them, "I think all of you were just trying to survive the best you could." The forgiveness inside his voice shattered something inside Evelyn completely. She covered her mouth while tears streamed freely down her face. Claire stood silently nearby, watching them beneath the rotating lighthouse beam, while a painful realization slowly unfolded inside her own chest too. Love was not always clean. Families were not always honest, and sometimes people ruined each other not because they lacked love, but because they loved too deeply while trapped inside impossible circumstances. Daniel wrapped his arms around Evelyn gently. For several long moments, the 3 of them stood together near the lighthouse while storm winds howled endlessly around them, and the Atlantic crashed violently beneath the cliffs like memory itself refusing to rest. Then finally Claire stepped forward too, and for the first time since arriving in Bar Harbor, she hugged her grandmother without anger. The storm passed some time before dawn. By morning, Bar Harbor emerged into one of those rare, quiet coastal days that feel almost sacred after violent weather, when the air smells washed clean by rain and the ocean settles into slow silver movement beneath pale winter sunlight. Fog drifted softly above the harbour. Fishing boats returned cautiously to the water, and inside the harbour house exhaustion lingered everywhere, like the final aftermath of emotional wreckage left behind by years finally collapsing into truth. Yet somehow the house itself felt lighter too, not happier exactly, but honest, an honesty Claire realized carried its own strange kind of peace. Thanksgiving dinner began quietly that evening. No elaborate decorations, no loud music, no forced cheerfulness pretending the previous days had never happened. Just family gathered together at one long wooden table while candlelight flickered softly across old photographs and rain-cleaned ocean light faded slowly beyond the windows. The kitchen smelled of roasted turkey, cinnamon, sage, and fresh bread. Daniel poured wine carefully while Jazz played softly through the old radio near the fireplace. Claire helped Evelyn carry dishes toward the table, and although neither woman fully knew how to repair all the damage between them yet, the silence no longer felt hostile, only tender, fragile, human. For most of dinner they spoke about ordinary things, childhood memories, Richard's terrible dancing at Christmas parties, the year Daniel nearly set the backyard on fire with illegal fireworks, the way Evelyn always overcooked Thanksgiving carrots, no matter how many timers she used. And slowly, gently, laughter returned to the house, small at first, then real. At one point, Daniel stood from the table and crossed quietly toward the piano in the corner of the living room. Without speaking, he began playing an old jazz melody Thomas had mentioned repeatedly in his letters. The music drifted softly through the candlelit room while ocean waves rolled quietly beyond the cliffs outside. Evelyn froze immediately, her eyes filled slowly with tears. Claire noticed her grandmother staring towards the darkened windows with an expression carrying both unbearable grief and profound gratitude all at once. Then finally Evelyn spoke. "There's one last thing you deserve to know." The room fell silent. Even the piano stopped. Evelyn folded her trembling hands together. "The summer before Richard died," she whispered, "he admitted something to me." Claire listened carefully. Evelyn smiled sadly toward the candlelight. "He said Thomas once asked him whether stealing another man's life ever became easier with time." Daniel lowered his eyes, and Grandpa said, Evelyn's voice cracked softly. "He said no, but loving her made it worth carrying." Silence consumed the room. Claire felt tears sliding down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying, because suddenly the entire tragedy of their family became heartbreakingly clear. Nobody had truly won. Nobody escaped pain. Yet somehow love still survived anyway. Through sacrifice, through silence, through impossible choices. Outside, the final sunset of the day slowly spread across the Atlantic in soft shades of gold, silver, and fading blue, while light filled the old house one final time before evening. Evelyn rose slowly from the table and walked toward the ocean-facing windows. Claire joined her quietly. Together they stood, watching waves move endlessly beneath the darkening sky. My whole life, Evelyn whispered, I thought secrets protected people. Claire looked at her grandmother gently. And now? Evelyn smiled through tears. Now I think truth arrives eventually, whether we're ready or not. The ocean below them shimmered beneath the last fading light, and somewhere deep within the quiet rhythm of waves against stone, Claire imagined she could almost feel the presence of everyone the years had carried away. Richard, Thomas, younger versions of themselves, all existing together now inside memory, where love and grief no longer needed to fight each other. Then Daniel began playing softly again behind them, while evening settled peacefully over the coastline, and for the first time in more than 60 years, Evelyn Harper no longer felt afraid of the past, because sometimes forgiveness does not arrive as a single moment. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like the ocean at dusk, returning again and again, until even the deepest wounds finally learn how to rest.